This is for the class BNT 101 Bible Survey, New Testament, Nebraska Christian College. This is Dr. Mark Krause, and this presentation is on the Intertestamental Period, sometimes called the 400 Years of Silence. I know there's some aversion to learning dates and learning history of things, but I really believe that it's important that sometimes we keep in mind how the flow of history. And so what I'd like to give you are some big dates from the Old Testament leading up to the New Testament era, and hopefully by understanding these we'll be able to have a better grasp of the situation when we get to the New Testament and to the first century. And I want to start back in the Old Testament and in the year 586, or some people date this 587, the Babylonians, who by this time had really gained control over Israel and been in control of it for about 20 years or so, they finally have had all they can take, and there's a rebellion, and they come in and besiege the city and take Jerusalem, kill lots and lots of people. But the worst thing is that they destroy the temple and they loot it. They take all the treasures of the temple to Babylon, and they also take some of the people from Israel to Babylon. So it's the fall of Jerusalem, 586, and it begins the period in Old Testament history that we call the Babylonian captivity. So they're in Babylon for quite a while, and in 539, Babylon itself, the Babylonian Empire, falls to the Persians, sometimes called the Persian Medes and the Persians, but the Medes are really somewhat inconsequential here. So it's the Persian Empire, and their king, the great king Cyrus, known as Cyrus the Great, is persuaded about this time to allow some of the Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Now, they're not going back to reestablish the nation of Israel, but just to rebuild the temple in its proper place. And so we think overall in several waves of return that maybe about 50,000 Jews return to Jerusalem and reestablish themselves there over a period of years, whereas in Babylon at this time there may have been as many as 2 million Jews. So the vast majority of Jews really still live in Babylon, and it is the center of Judaism for many years to come. This temple is finally completed about 515 through the efforts of sometimes he's called a king, but really the Persian Jewish governor named Zerubbabel and his helper Joshua the high priest, and with the help of the prophets Haggai and to a lesser degree Zechariah, who are operating in the. Now, several decades after this, a very learned man named Ezra, comes from Babylon to Jerusalem to teach the law. And this is a change and a reestablishment of the way that Judaism understands itself. In this period, by the way, we'll see several things, but one of the things that's happened is that they've developed a type of worship in a localized setting that we call the synagogue. So they have the temple now, but not everybody can get to the temple. So they learn Torah, they learn the law in synagogue. And then in about 10 years or so later, 445 BC, a man named Nehemiah is allowed by the Persian monarch to come back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city itself, especially the wall, which is in disrepair, and the city is a dangerous place. Not too long after this, about this era, about 440 BC, we would think the book of Malachi is written, and Malachi is the last of the prophets, and his book is surely one of the latest books of the Old Testament, one of the last books to be written. So this begins kind of this period, sometimes called the 400 years of silence up until the New Testament era. But it's not 400 years of inactivity. About 332 BC, Alexander the Great, the just really horrible person, brutal, barbaric Greek conqueror, is sweeping across the Eastern world and subjugating these nations and creating battles where there was no need for war except for his lust to conquer. Um, and he gets to Palestine in 332 and really takes it without a fight. They are somewhat glad to have him come, and a lot of the Jews welcome him, and I won't go into details. Alex, dies in 323 BC, so barely 10 years later. And after he dies, his kingdom is divided. I'm going to try to turn on my laser pointer here to show you a little bit of what this is. Uh, After Alexander the Great dies, his kingdom is divided among his generals. And one of them is a guy by the name of Ptolemy. And Ptolemy's and his descendants take over Egypt. Egypt is ruled by Greeks. They called themselves pharaohs. The most famous of the Ptolemies, and one of the last of them, is a woman actually who rules as a pharaoh. Her name is Cleopatra. So here's the irony. These are Egyptians, but they're being ruled by Greeks, Greek-speaking people whose original place of origin is Macedonia up here in the northern part of Greece. Another General Seleucus, takes over what becomes the Seleucid Empire, and it really, even though it kind of extends way out here, these are areas that Alexander conquered, and this would have been the Persian area here. This would have been the Babylonian area here in Iraq. But this is centered in Antioch, a city that they build in what's called Syria. So these are the Syrian rulers, and they are also Greeks. So these are Greek speakers. They bring in a Hellenistic type of culture, meaning a Greek culture. Alexander the Great, by the way, believed that the Greek culture was superior to any culture in the world, and he was sort of a missionary for Greek culture. His tutor, his teacher, private teacher, was the most famous philosopher of the age, a fellow by the name of Aristotle. So he wasn't the greatest student in the world, but he did believe the Greek language, the Greek way of thinking, their philosophy, the Greek religion for that matter, was superior to all of the other cultures. Now you can see here, though, you've got these Ptolemies down here, these Egyptians, and you've got these Syrians up here, and Israel right here is sort of in between. And so for the next 100+ years, sometimes Israel's under the control of the Egyptians, sometimes it's under control of the Syrians. But when these guys go to war, this is the battleground. This is one of the problems of the nation of Israel even today, is that it is a crossroads for many nations, and because of that has been the site of many battles. So we refer to that as a buffer state. But what I want you to remember is that these guys, they're the Seleucians or the Syrians. These guys are the Egyptians or the Ptolemies. But both of them are really Greeks of a type, even though they haven't been to Greece for a long time. All right, let me see if I can turn that guy off. And let's go on with important things. In this period then, about 250 BC, roughly, the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek. And I cannot overestimate how important this is. This is done in Alexandria, which is a city in Egypt at the mouth of the Nile River, sort of. And it is the great city founded by Alexander, and probably at this point the second greatest city in the world next to Rome. Rome is rising, but maybe at this point in history, Alexandria is the greatest city, maybe as many as 1 million people, which is an enormous city for the ancient world. So there are a lot of Jews who end up in Alexandria. We think the Jewish population in Alexandria may have been 100 to 200,000 Jews. So the problem is they begin to speak Greek also, and they don't know Hebrew anymore, and so they can't read their own Bible. And we don't know the real details behind this, but the result is that the Old Testament, what we consider the Old Testament, is translated into Greek, and we call that the Septuagint. And the legend is that it was produced by 70 scholars in 70 days. There's a lot of variations on that legend. But because of that, we use the Roman numeral LXX to represent the Septuagint. So if you see in Bible books about the Bible LXX, that means the Greek Old Testament. This is important because the Septuagint is the Bible of the early church, and it is the primary source of quotations in the New Testament. So when the New Testament authors are quoting the Old Testament, they do it using this Greek translation of the Old Testament, not using Hebrew, the original language. During this period, additional books are written in Greek that are included in the Septuagint, in this collection. And these are not originally written in Hebrew, they are written in Greek. They are sometimes called deuterocanonical books, meaning a second canon, or referred to as the Apocrypha. And I'll say a little bit more about this in class, but these were generally considered to be scripture until the time of the Protestant Reformation. And basically Martin Luther cut them out of the Bible. So this is the reason why Protestants or evangelicals, the Bibles that we use, have a different collection of books than we might find in a Roman Catholic Bible. So if you have Catholic friends, or if you have a Catholic background, you may be familiar with books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, not found in the Protestant Bibles. And this is the reason, and we'll explain this a little bit more in class. Going to history, in 167 BC, the Syrian overlords, they're in control of Jerusalem at that time, they have a particularly nasty king, and his name is Antiochus. And he is sometimes called, he's the fourth Antiochus, so sometimes he'll be called Antiochus the Fourth, but more popularly he is known as Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes is a word in Greek that means something like appearance and has the connotation of the appearance of a god. So he takes on this nickname that indicates that he thinks when he shows up in a city or in a village that they are having the great privilege of being visited by a type of god. He is such a wonderful person. Well, to make a long story short, he does sort of a military adventure, goes down and fights the Egyptians and really gets spanked, and is upset, and he comes back and he gets angry with the Jews, especially in Jerusalem. And he's just tired of their stuff, and he's thinking, the problem with the Jews is their religion. If we would just get them to be Greeks in their religion, everything would be better. And so again, to make a very long story short, he authorizes that the temple in Jerusalem be converted into a pagan temple, and they, on the great altar to Jehovah, to the Lord, in the temple in Jerusalem, they construct on top of it a pagan altar to Zeus and sacrifice a pig. And there is nothing that could have been more damaging and more just incredibly offensive to the Jewish people than to have their temple defiled, both by the worship of a pagan god and by the sacrifice of a pig, the ultimate unclean animal. So he just enrages the Jews, and they put up with a lot, and this is sort of the end of their tolerance. These are stories that are told in the book of Maccabees. Just to show you a few things here on this coin, I rotated it, and I know this is in Greek, but I'll translate for you. Basileus, king, Antiochon, Antiochus, and then you get the word theon, God, Epiphanon, the appearance of God. So this is what he put on his coinage, and I know it's sideways here, but you find right here a little goddess figure crowning him. He is on his throne, and he is holding a trident, which is a sign of Poseidon, the most powerful, or one of the most powerful of the Greek gods. So, again, to make a very complicated story brief, there is a Jewish village priest named Matthias, and Matthias and his 5 sons lead a revolt against these Syrian Greeks. The greatest of these sons emerges as really a brilliant military leader, and his name is Judas. And he defeats the Syrians in some major battles to their surprise, and it should not have happened. They were much better trained and better equipment and everything, but he's just a really good military leader. His men will do just about anything for him. He is so effective, he is finally given the name the Hammer. And in Greek, and probably through Aramaic, we're not exactly sure, but tradition tells us that that name, the Hammer, becomes the name Maccabee or Maccabeus. So this is Judas Maccabeus, and his followers are known as the Maccabees. And finally, after many battles, in 164 BC, they retake Jerusalem. The temple is cleansed, washed out clean, all the paganness is washed away, and worship is restored. And there is a legend at this time that they want to light some candles, or some lamps actually, and they don't have enough oil for the celebration, and yet there's just a little bit of this dedicated oil left over from the earlier period of the temple, and it lasts for the entire time where it should not have. This is seen as a miracle, and becomes the festival of lights that we see in the New Testament, and is still celebrated today by Jewish people, and it's called Hanukkah. So it comes either in late November or in early December, just before Christmas time for us. So Hanukkah. And Hanukkah is seen kind of as a celebration of Jewish patriotism and independence, not even so much as a religious holiday, because it's when Judas Maccabeus retakes the temple and restores their nation. So what we get then is this period, and they are independent and establish themselves sort of as kings again. A lot of history here. It's also during this period that you can see on this map kind of the range of their territory. Let me pull up the laser pointer again a little bit here. They are also then the lords of Samaria. Remember, we talked about the Sumerians before as being these people who were kind of Jewish origin, but were not allowed to help in Jerusalem. And because of that, they end up building their own temple in near Shechem, and it's on a mountain called Mount Gerizim. So they build what they think is the legitimate temple. They use some of the same books that the Jews do. So this is the background of the question of the Samaritan woman. Should we worship in Jerusalem or in Shechem or on this mountain where they are at the time of the story? And the real problem here is that one of the Hasmonean rulers, I think this is about 125 BC, he gets pretty tired of the Samaritans, so he destroys their temple on Mount Gerizim. So when Jesus is talking to the woman, the temple up on Mount Gerizim is just laying in ruins. And you might imagine this causes some hard feelings between the Samaritans and the Jews of Judea. One of the interesting dynamics of the New Testament era, though, is that up here in Galilee, in this region, we have primarily Jewish people. Down here in Judea, we have Jewish people. In between, we have Samaritans. So they are divided by territory. Well, we move then to the Roman period, and the Hasmonean rulers go for about 100 years. They become actually quite corrupt, and they're controlling the priesthood and what they call the king, and it's all family business kind of stuff, and they become very wealthy and unresponsive. People are very tired of them. So in 63 BC, the Romans are beginning to exert their influence, and coming up from Egypt is the great Roman general Pompey, known as Pompey the Great. And basically he takes Jerusalem without a fight. They are tired of the Hasmoneans and they're ready for Roman rule, and they welcome him. Now, one of the interesting stories about Pompey is that the temple is there, and by now, this second temple is over 400 years old. It's not a new thing, but he's told about this Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum, the place where at one time at least the Ark of the Covenant had been. Nobody's quite sure if the Ark of the Covenant is there now, because nobody is allowed to go in except for the high priest once a year, and he's not telling. So one of the stories is that Pompey goes in. He goes into the Holy of Holies, and he doesn't really say what he finds in there, but Jewish people are not really happy with that. So it kind of sets this whole Roman period off on the wrong footing, and they make a series of errors after that. And in 40 BC, a kind of quasi-Jew by the name of Herod is influential in the city of Rome among the Senate, and is appointed to be the governor and even allowed to use the title of king of the Jews, but not really given any support. So he is what we call an Idumean, meaning he's really of the lineage of the Edomites. You might remember from Old Testament survey, the Edomites were the descendants of Esau rather than Jacob, these two brothers. Jacob, Jews. Esau, Edomites. So this is really where Herod comes from. He acts like a Jew, but really is more of a pagan, and he's very Hellenistic, very Greek, and he's spent a lot of time in Rome. He's very Romanized, and very urban. So he manages, though, by 37 BC to gain control of Jerusalem and establish himself as king. And just a couple more things about. In 20 BC, he decides that he will make himself popular among the Jews by beginning a temple rebuilding project. So he begins rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem to make it, when it's done, it is the most magnificent building probably in the ancient world. He spares no expense. He expands it to be huge. And the problem was the Jews did not trust him. I mean, how would you want to rebuild the temple? Well, the easiest way would be to tear it down and build a new one, but they're not going to let him do that. So it's a very slow process. The construction itself is carried on only by priests or Levites who are trained to do the construction, and they could only tear down a few feet of the old temple at a time and rebuild it. So it ends up with 13 acres of courtyards, and it is not finished. It begins in 20 BC. It's not finished till AD 62, 82 years later. So when Jesus is in Jerusalem, both as a boy and later where he goes to meet his death, at that time, this temple is still under construction. It's not done yet. One of the things that we know is that it had a lavish entrance from Herod's palace. You can kind of see it. This is a model in a hotel in Jerusalem that you can go view. It's a pretty large scale model, and you see it in pictures all the time. Here's the main part of the temple, the sanctuary, and inside here would be the holy place, and then in the back would be the curtain of the temple, the veil, and the Holy of Holies. And over here there's a causeway, a walkway that comes across, and back in this area is Herod's palace. So when he designs it, he also kind of designs this grand private entrance for him to come to the temple whenever he would like. So let me finish up this presentation by talking about the descendants of Herod very briefly. In the book of Matthew and in other mentions in the New Testament, Herod is Herod the Great. This is the beginner of this dynasty, Herod the Great. And Herod is a family name, but it's used something like the name Caesar is for the Romans. So the king for a while is always going to be Herod. He has a number of descendants that are mentioned in the New Testament, and so it's hard to keep the Herods straight. Let me just give you a very brief summary of them. One of these is his son, Archelaus, and he's mentioned in Matthew chapter 2. You might remember that Joseph is told he needs to flee to Egypt because of Herod trying to find his son and kill him. And then he learns that Herod has died and his son Archelaus is ruling in his stead. Well, Herod was an evil man. He was a very selfish, evil man, but he was pretty competent. Archelaus is evil and incompetent, and finally the Jews are so tired of him that they send a delegation to Rome and sort of tattle on him, and the Roman Senate makes him come, puts him in exile, and removes him from power. A second Herod we run into is another son of Herod the Great named Antipas, Herod Antipas. And he also, he's allowed to have sort of a northern part of Palestine, Herod Archelaus in Judea and Jerusalem originally, and Antipas is up to the north in Galilee and some of these regions. He builds a city on the coast of the Sea of Galilee named Tiberias in honor of his great friend, the Emperor Tiberius. And he rules until AD 39, fairly competent. He's the one who shows up in the story of John the Baptist, who has John the Baptist beheaded as a favor to his stepdaughter Salome and her mother Herodias. And he also is the Herod at the trial of Jesus, mentioned in the book of Luke, that Pilate's putting Jesus on trial. He finds out Herod's in town and sends Jesus over to him. A third one is in Acts chapter 12. We have a guy just called Herod. This is actually the grandson of Herod the Great, and he is more properly known as Herod Agrippa the First. So he's the one who puts the apostle James to death. He's the one who is going to execute Peter, and Peter is miraculously rescued, and that's in Acts chapter 12. And then finally we have his son, who would be the great-grandson of Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa the Second, properly, and he's the last of the Herods. He's the one who Paul appears before in Acts chapter 26, and he's just called Agrippa there. But he is also one of the Herods. So there's a couple of other ones too. I'm not giving you all of them, but these are the ones that are specifically mentioned and kind of play a role in the New Testament. Okay, so that's the end of this lecture. Thank you very much.